Good afternoon, Internet. I am Lucius Guthrie, here filling in for Kirkwood Bullis for our sermon recap. My guest today is actually Kirkwood Bullis, filling in for Pastor Mac Brunson, who is on vacation.
Thank you, Lucius. Grateful to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. Good to be here also. So thanks for having me. So, Pastor is out of town, which means yesterday on Sunday morning, Kirkwood brought our sermon. It was great. It was really encouraging out of Romans 12, verse 1, kind of verse 2. I think you read verse 2, but really just kind of mainly focused on verse 1. How'd you feel? Did you enjoy preaching?
Oh, you know me. I love to preach. I'm the son of a Baptist preacher, and so it's one of those things I've just seen so many messages, and you guys know around the office how good I am at talking at length.
We time them every now and then,
which hurts my feelings, but I understand that it's all for my good and your happiness.
It is. It makes me very happy.
Just to time how long ago.
Yeah.
The worst is when I'll say something like, "Guys, I just need 5 minutes to talk about this," and and I regret immediately committing to a time because I know I'm not going to stay to it.
Yeah.
Lord help me.
Never.
Anyway, this podcast shouldn't be more than 12 minutes or so.
Okay, yeah, good to know. So set your timer, Joseph. So I want to say the way you opened it up was really great, really going through kind of the whole book of Romans to kind of really put us in perspective of the context of where we were when we get to chapter 12. And that was really cool. I've heard this before, but seeing it laid out really is really helpful. Paul just laying out the gospel in those first 11 chapters and then saying, because of this, we are transformed. This is your spiritual worship, to present yourself as transformed, and here's how you do it. It takes the next 4 chapters, 12 through 16, to do that. So any more kind of advice implications of that speak to what you were talking about yesterday?
It was just a surprise to me as I was studying through. This has been a life verse to me for years and years now. So since right before I went over to China as a missionary, I remember this idea of not being conformed to the world, living as a sacrifice. To tell you the truth, it wasn't until I began to prepare this message that I understood where this fell. For all of our theologians out there, I mean, what the outline I gave with regards to Romans is overly simplistic. But it is true that he has been going through theology, and then he really goes over to a much more practical application. The idea that worship is the tipping point was really interesting to me, and it also, I didn't talk about it yesterday, but it kind of backs up that idea that John Piper famously said, missions exist because worship doesn't. I could talk about that for a while, but I guess I don't have too much additional insight there. But I do like to be able to say that a lot of times I'm learning this only a few days before the congregation learns it.
Yeah.
It's not like I've known this all my life. I'm just honored to be able to present it to people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's cool to see at the end of chapter 11 how he's just saying, what Christ has done, what this means for us, and then just immediately responds, what are those verses, 33 to 36, just with a hymn. That is, worship is just a response of seeing what Jesus has done for us.
It's also interesting that after explaining in great detail the gospel, you're talking about thousands of words, that he still acknowledges that it's a mystery, that he doesn't completely understand the depth of the knowledge of God.
Yeah. That's good. So then after talking about that, you really dove into verse 1, presenting ourselves as living sacrifices. And so you really focused on this living sacrifice, how, a sacrifice up until Christ, it had died. The sacrifice was dead. It never came back to life. The people who were reading this really understood what the word sacrifice meant a lot more than what we do today. And so what are the implications of this focus, how it is now a living sacrifice based on what Christ did and now how we can respond to that?
Well, the one implication that we didn't talk about yesterday is that in order to live as a sacrifice, you have to be crucified with Christ. Paul talks in Galatians about how he's crucified with Christ, and yet I live. Jesus, wasn't technically a sacrifice until he was sacrificed, right?
Yeah.
So, I when we come to Christ, and we lose sight of this a lot when we're witnessing, but when you come to Christ, like you're laying aside your entire life. You're dying to yourself.
Yeah.
A lot of times you're dying in the eyes of the world. When a Muslim comes to faith, their family will basically write their obituary. You're dead to us because you've died to the Islamic faith. You've died to everything that we hold dear. And the world doesn't put it in those terms, but that's effectively what's happening. You're dying to the world's sexual ethic. You're dying to the world's sense of morality or lack of morality. And you're coming alive to something else. And you're living now daily as a sacrifice to Christ. That was another thing we didn't talk about too much. I know that the title of the message is Worship Weekly, and that's what fits in with our discipleship pathway. We do worship corporately in general, weekly, but it is mysterious, but it's still true that we're now a continual sacrifice. We're laid as a continual sacrifice moment by moment as well. Paul again talks about taking every thought captive for the sake of Christ. Another way of putting that is that every thought would be sacrificed to Christ. That's the way I have to think a lot of the times, because there's so many things that I convince myself are good, or things that I think have greater value perhaps than focusing on Christ, and I have to listen for the Spirit's prompting that I might know that to pursue Christ even with my thoughts is better.
Yeah, I think that brings me something to mind, just to give you insight into Kirkwood's brain just every now and then. A Kirkwood Willis original is the Bible. I remember you saying this. The Bible puts a lot more emphasis on holiness than we give it credit. A lot of the times where we try to find gray area to live life maybe like the old self, but Jesus is very clear that to follow him we have to take up our cross daily. And he's saying this before he even went to the cross. So we see it in this perspective that he's representing, he's mentioning, yes, this is the cross. This is how he sacrificed for us, but he's saying this to the people before that, and they see they're understanding that is a big commitment to go to a cross, to kill something, and what you're saying is that old self.
Yeah, it's more than a commitment, it's a death sentence. And that's yet another one of those teachings where the people heard the teaching, they looked at one another, they said, this is a very hard teaching, who can understand it? And then they deserted Christ, most of the people. Because, well, like you said, they hadn't seen what Jesus was actually going to do. They hadn't seen the completed work, so they didn't know in what context he was saying those things.
Yeah.
But maybe it's helpful for us to think of it from their perspective, just what it looks like to actually live in radical submission to Christ, to put your sin to death, to murder your sin. That has been it's been a struggle for me over these last few years, now becoming a father, having 3 young children, and understanding, it's an easy joke to make that you start to understand the depth of all of our sin with young children just because of how blatant they are with their sin. But what's different about us and children? Absolutely nothing. We have the exact same sin nature, and we're just a lot better at hiding it.
Yeah.
So for me personally, the Lord has given me a really deep burden, especially for people that are in the worship music community, because that area of church staffing has generally been given kind of a free pass to be more of the world. And that's not just unfortunate, could be heretical, depending on how you view it. So that's something that I'm thinking about, and I guess that's what I was thinking about whenever I said that thing that you said that I said, even though I don't remember saying it.
So transitioning from maybe the personal to the congregational, something you talked about was this phrasing toward the end of the verse saying, this is your true worship. Some say true spiritual worship. Some say rational, reasonable service. And you talked about how this has really big, this affects the way that we gather as a corporate body on Sundays. How that it serves our services. So, what are some things that this shows how we should gather corporately?
Well, I know that you're a CSB guy. What's it say there?
Yeah, this says true worship. So I think the one you had was spiritual worship.
Yeah,
right?
the ESV says spiritual worship, and then there's reasonable service. I think the KJV is reasonable service, and then the NASB actually says worship. I can't remember if it's I think it might be rational worship. But it's interesting because they're translated in such different ways. I mean, Paul is talking about this in context of worship. So even if it says service, I think you have to look at those as synonymous. How do we know that? Well, because he's talking about sacrifice, which, as we said in the message yesterday, sacrifice is clearly a form of worship. But honestly, yeah, I'm glad you came back to this, Lucius, because for me, this was the hardest part of the message. This was the place where I think my thoughts weren't quite as developed, just because. But regardless, you can see that there is something cultural that's happening. That we don't really talk about the worship service as an act of service that much anymore. Yeah. Ever since the worship wars, the 70s, mid 20th century and beyond, you have people that are so worried about what the genre of music is, and they get more worried about that than they do about what we're here for.
Yeah.
And that could be a sermon series in itself. What are we here for? Well, we're here to praise the living God, and then if you understand how great He actually is, well, it becomes very reasonable indeed to spend your time worshiping Him.
Yeah, that's good, and that flowed really well into your two big practical takeaways. One being that time, this Sunday service that we're talking about is not about us. And the second one, very much in tandem with that, is it's all about Jesus. But you brought this tension in that I think is really helpful to understand, is that it's not about us, but it is for us. It is helpful for us. What is that tension? How do we understand that?
Well, the theological, the sort of academic phrase is the healthy tension. We exist in a healthy tension, and we know that the gospel is full of these healthy tensions. The most famous, of course, is the already not yet. We're already redeemed for eternity, and our salvation is secure, and yet we're not there yet. Yeah. We're seated with Christ in heavenly places, and yet we're still sinning. We have this treasure, but it's in jars of clay. That tension exists, and it's especially explaining that to a new believer is difficult. Yeah. So I would say that this is just another healthy tension that exists in how we understand the gospel. When we worship, it is not about you. But you better do this because part of it's about you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It doesn't.
To be blatantly clear, it is and is not about you.
Yes. So now that we've cleared that up, I guess the more specific way you could put it is that it's the subject matter. The subject matter is all about Jesus.
Yeah.
And the effect and benefit is really felt by you, because our God is eternal, unchanging. He has need of nothing.
Yeah.
So really the worship, spreads His fame and glory and whatnot, but it's not changing Him the way that it changes us. That's a beautiful thing to think about.
That's good.
That worship forms us. Read a great book a couple of years ago. It's called Desiring the Kingdom by James K.A. Smith. Really, really changed my perspective on worship. I think he's a conservative Presbyterian, very high view of Scripture, and he talked. And this is what contributed my feelings on holiness, because if we believe what the Bible says, then we believe that we are what we eat, both physically and also spiritually. Anything that we take into our mind, that forms us. So if we're taking in more worship, that's more of who we are. Just think about that for a minute. So that's why, that's a great segue. I'm glad you thought of it. Great segue into why we're putting all of these resources out there.
Yeah.
Like, we're giving people an opportunity to say, like, hey, we're your church family, and we're going to come with you. We're going to give you more things to listen to in the car, which will help you worship the Lord. More things to listen to when you rise up and when you go to sleep. We're going to give you resources that help you disciple your family, because, you might have thought before, well, that's only for the real Christians. Well, I shouldn't listen to that much stuff. That's for the, for the super Christians. When in reality, like, it's more for your good than you could possibly realize. I'm living proof of that. One of the reasons I feel called to people in the worship community is because I used to be a card-carrying member of somebody who desired to be of the world but have a Christian label.
Yeah. It's convicting for sure.
It's convicting to me.
Yeah. So, a couple plugs, what Kirkwood was just talking about. Each Monday, our pastor gives a kind of a description, or rather a look back of something that's happening in history. We know that Pastor Mac is a huge historian and theologian, so he marriages those things, and we look at, what's it called? At This Time.
At This
is what
Time.
it's called, and so he looks at a date that's happening a long time ago, and talks about it and explains the history and how it can have really cool implications of us today, whether in light of Scripture. And then that's released on Monday. But during the Christmas break, actually, December and January, we're going to be releasing something called Parenting Today for Tomorrow.
I'm excited about that one.
Really excited about it.
And you're hosting that one, right?
No, I'm just part of the filming.
Oh,
okay. No, I'm not on it.
I know that you're behind the scenes, though.
Yeah,
You're
behind
a
the
serious
scenes on that one.
contributor.
Josh Knierim, our student pastor, is hosting that one. But we bring a lot of people on it in our discipleship department to talk about parenting tips and what it means to really disciple your family, which I think is a really, really great tool.
Well, and that's a huge need in our community. So if you guys like the resources that we're putting out there, make sure that you let us know on social media, send us an email, or just tell us on Sunday morning, because we're not just doing these just so that we can say, hey, look at all these resources we have. We're doing them as a help. So we want to know whether they help, and if they don't help, we want to be able to do something different.
Yeah. Final plug, if you are listening to this live or either soon after it is put out on October 28th or maybe 29th, this Wednesday, October 30th, here at the church, we are going to be having our Fall Fest. It's going to be massive. We have a ton of people interested from the community coming. It will be indoors.
Indoors.
Yes, there is a high percentage chance of rain, so we're going to be moving it virtually certain, which is okay because rain is good. It is from the Lord, but that means we will be having the Fall Fest inside. Yes, here is our tiny graphic, if you can see it all the way from that camera. Any other notes that we need to let them know of, because this is actually new information today?
We've talked about everything. Fall Fest is the big deal. And make sure you're here this coming Sunday, because Pastor Barry is going to be following up with how we live on mission as we serve the church.
Yep, absolutely.
Good job, Lucius.
I appreciate it. Thanks for listening. I am Lucius Guthrie, in for Kirkwood Bullis, with Kirkwood Bullis, in for Pastor Matt. See you next time.
Peace out.